It's a beautiful night in the hood. It's a beautiful night in the hood. Gonna be hanging out in the hood.
Hi, welcome to Almost Cooperstown. I'm Mark, and this is Gordon, and we love talking about baseball.
Tonight is Monday, July 12th. We're a few hours out from the Home Run Derby in Coors Field, and that could really be argued tonight to be the bigger event of the 2 days, just given all the hype around it. You know, you've got Ohtani, you've got Pete Alonso coming back to really defend what people would consider the true crown after sort of last year. So it's kind of interesting that the All-Star Game has really, in some ways, kind of gone full circle back to its original roots and sort of become an exhibition again.
Right. And today, Ohtani is going to lead off, and he's also the starting for the American League. I don't think that has ever happened before in any Major League Baseball game that the pitcher was a left hitter. So
it is just interesting looking at where, the All-Star Game is today and kind of where it's come from, because there were a lot of things that, like, when we started kind of talking about the All-Star Game that we didn't know about, and we kind of got lucky that we were able to talk with somebody here today that is actually a pretty big expert in the All-Star Games and a lot of historical baseball stuff, and that is Gary Livacari, who's a member of Sabre. Gary, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
No problem. So, we wanted to bring Gary on today so that we could discuss a lot of the things that he is really an expert in, and that is going over a lot of the stuff from early baseball stuff. He's actually written a book called The 1919 Black Sox Reflections on the 1919 Black Sox. But there's a lot of stuff that you've also looked into that goes along with the All-Star Games and some of the Negro leagues as well, correct?
Sure. That's correct. Yes.
And so, we wanted to bring you here today because we were looking back on it, and there were a lot of things that, I never really knew. So, the first All-Star Game took place in Chicago, but frankly,
right.
Shockingly, it wasn't at Wrigley. It was at Comiskey Park.
Oh, sure. Absolutely, yeah. That was Comiskey Park. The White Sox were, a big team back then, and everything started at Comiskey. The man who started it, who came up with the idea, his name was Arch Ward, who was the sports editor of the Chicago Tribune. And he actually is buried not far from where I live. I found his grave once when I was looking for Gabby Hartnett's grave and Freddie Lindstrom, and I found they were real close to each other. But Arch Ward was an interesting guy. He also came up with the College All-Star Game. I don't know if you guys remember that or not, where the NFL champion played a bunch of college all-stars. I think that game went on into the 1950s. And he also came up with the Golden Glove boxing tournament too. So he was a real innovative guy. He came up with the idea for the first All-Star Game. It was during the Depression, 1933, as a way of raising the spirits of the people during the Depression. And Comiskey was a much bigger park. It held 45, 50,000 people. Wrigley Field did not do that.
Yeah, and that is a big difference. And this guy, Arch Ward was convinced this was going to be a success. He was so certain of it. The story goes that he actually told McCormick, who was the a publisher for the Chicago Tribune, that
the owner
if it didn't work, he could just take the money out of Ward's paycheck.
I hadn't heard that, but that probably makes sense. They framed it after the Eddie Joss benefit game in 1911, I think it was. That was the first prototype of an All-Star Game. And I think Arch Ward had that in mind. And then he formulated this. The timing was good because it was during the Depression, and it went over real well. What I read, it was only supposed to be a one-time event, but it was such a success that they kept it going.
Oh, yeah. And then they were really smart because, you had the very first year, you had your fan voting. Ballots were printed in 55 newspapers across the countries.
That's right.
People were casting hundreds of thousands of votes. Obviously, Babe Ruth was the top vote getter at the time, but people were able to say, no, this guy should go and play in what they were calling at the time of the game of the century.
Game of the century, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what it was. And it was, like I said, it was a huge success. It was a an event in Chicago during the Depression called the Century of Progress. That it was to be part of that celebration, and that's how it started. And then obviously, like I said, they kept it going. Now, interesting, in the first World Series, Babe Ruth hits the first home run, so that was a big attraction. And also, he made, I know this sort of gets lost, but he made a tremendous catch, apparently, in the 8th inning up against the wall in right field at Comiskey Park, which was another memorable moment from that All-Star game. Lefty Gomez, I believe, was the winning pitcher, too.
I mean, yeah, you had a ton of big names in that world, in that All-Star game.
Oh, that's okay, yeah, I can tell you that. There was, of the 36 players, 20 were future Hall of Famers, including two Hall of Fame umpires, Bill Clem and Bill McGowan. Another interesting thing, too, was they started, I believe Bill Clem started behind home plate, or maybe it was McGowan. And then in the 5th inning, they switched because they went from a National League umpire at home to an American League umpire at home. And they also switched the ball. They started out with a National League game ball, authentic National League, and then they switched the ball to an American League game also in the 5th inning. So they had a lot of stuff like that going on.
Yeah, just to make sure it was perfectly fair. You didn't have the National League umpires ruling one way for them, even though the American League team did end up winning that very first All-Star game.
They did, yeah, and they won the next game too. And it wasn't until 36, I believe, the National League actually won the first game.
And those first games were played during the day, right? I mean, there was no night games, right?
No. Those are in front of, I think the attendance 49,000 fans for that first game. It's pretty big for a first-time event. They have, that draw that big. But I mean, you think of the names that were playing in that game, And you have to remember too that baseball was the sport. There was no other professional sports. Everybody was involved. It was a big part of the culture. So you put all those factors into the pot there, and you can see why it was such a huge success.
And I think it's actually interesting because one of the things that you could talk about with that very first All-Star game is something that's kind of been diluted by interleague play today. And that's in that All-Star game, how many of those Hall of Fame players, 20 of them in that game, actually played each other for the very first time in that game?
Absolutely. Well, that's a very good point. And I like to make that point. Interleague play has basically destroyed the rivalry that was in existence during those early years of the All-Star game. And when we get to a later one, 41, I always like to mention that Ted Williams, with his Hall of Fame tremendous career that he had, he always says his walk-off home run to win the 1941 World Series was the highlight of his career. I mean, that's quite a statement when you think of all the accomplishments the guy like Ted Williams. That
one moment to him was the high point.
It was a walk-off home run. We'll probably talk about that one in a couple minutes, but what I mean, I've heard him, I've read of him saying that it was the highlight of his career was winning that All-Star game. That gives you an idea of what the interleague rivalry was back in those days. And that's been largely lost.
Kind of a lament, though, in this case, because he never won a World Series, so he didn't have that experience.
Right, that's true.
But I think it's interesting that obviously in 1997 you started interleague play, which definitely started to kind of back off the interest in the All-Star because you could see the players playing. So then, of course, we had that wild 15-year stretch where Major League Baseball decided, well, what if the All-Star game decided World Series?
Oh, geez.
Home team advantage. And people forget the very first year they try it is the only year I think the All-Star game has ever ended in a draw.
There were two, actually. But
there was two. There's two draws. Okay. Yeah. What was the other draw then?
I don't know what the year, but there was another one.
So in that 2002 year, they ran out of pitchers and the game ended 7-7. So the very first year was supposed to mean something. It meant nothing because they couldn't decide on it.
I know.
Yeah. The other draw was in 1961. And of course, and we kind of talked about this in our prep for the show, there were 4 years where they played two Major League Baseball All-Star games.
And I'm old enough to remember all those too. Absolutely. I think it was, I want to say 59 to 62. I can't be off here, but somewhere along those lines.
So those years, were they playing two All-Star games because it was just like a revenue thing? They wanted to get the players out on the field twice, or was it like a way of honoring more players?
No, because it was the same teams.
Okay.
It was the same teams. I think it was a revenue thing. I remember hearing what arcane reason that they did it, but I don't remember it offhand. But it had something to do with revenue. So, I mean, as usual. But, one other point I wanted to make was, like, when I was a kid, I was a Cub fan. A lot of my friends were White Sox fans. So the All-Star Game was huge for kids in the city of Chicago. I can tell you that, for league rivalries, bragging rights, all that kind of stuff. It was just a very big thing.
Yeah. And it's been a close series its entire,
I just wanted to make real quick was I remember a period, it probably was in the 60s, when all of a sudden the National League just started winning game after game after game after game. It was probably like 6 or 7 in a row.
19 out of 1920. 19 out of 20, the National League.
Oh, is that what it was? 19, okay.
From 1963 to 1982.
Right, yeah. Okay.
So they just dominate. So
they just absolutely dominated.
That's wild, because right now the series total is 45 wins for the AL and 43 wins for the NL. So the NL won 19 out of 20 in like a single period, and it's still they're still behind. It's only a 2-thing split.
Well, because later on, your dad might remember this too, all of a sudden the American League started dominating. I remember it was more recent years, but every year, I mean, for a National League fan like me, it was, like, oh God, they lost again. Can we please just get a win here? It was like, they had a huge streak going too. So I'm surprised it's as close. The totals are as close as it is. 40, what did we say? 45 to 43, I believe it is.
45-43, and so the total runs over the history of the All-Star games. The AL has 370 and the NL has 370, which, considering the scores are all over the place, they're that close is remarkable.
Yeah, it really is. That's a good point. I didn't know that, but and you got, guys like Hank Aaron was in 24, 25 games. I think he has the record on Willie Mays, 24. Musial, I think, also has like 24 too. And people always ask, well, how could that be? Because how could they have been in that many games? It's because they had 2. They were in both games.
So you actually ended up playing. You only got the 1 All-Star knob, but you got 2 games played.
Yes, you got 2 games played. So there's a discrepancy. I can't tell you how often that comes up whenever I write about the All-Star Game. That'll always come up. People always wonder, well, you have to be as old as I am to remember that, I think. So.
and it's bragging rights, right, of course, because it was important then and actually they really want to beat the American League and vice versa.
Oh, sure.
But there's also money. I mean, it's hard for today's fans to realize
that's another part
how
of it.
All-Star Game money would a difference, but it did.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a big part of it back then too. Yeah, they played, for the love of the game and the interleague rival. Oh, and the other thing was you didn't have players moving from league to league, like you said. Most of these guys they were American League guys or they were National League guys, and they played their entire careers that way, with some exceptions. But for the most part, you can see why there was loyalty to your league, and you wanted to beat the other league. It was a big thing.
Gordon had talked about how the fans selected the All-Stars earlier, and that was surprisingly impressive for Major League Baseball. It was not normally known for that kind of
I think the first game
around.
I think the first game the fans picked the starters or something, and then the managers picked the reserves or something along those lines. So there was a mix there, but it was definitely fans were involved. And then over time, of course, as you guys know, that changed back and forth different times. I know this sounds, bad, I guess, but I always liked it when the managers and the players picked the teams rather than the fans. I just never could get my head around the fans, from the big major markets favoring their own players. I never thought that was fair.
So it literally happened one year in 1957. The Reds fans stuffed the ballot box so that a Red was starting in every single position except first base. And it's just it's not an all-star vote at that point. It's a popularity contest.
That's right. That's what I mean. And I've never thought that was fair. If you're from a smaller market, you're going to get cut out because you don't have the fan base. So I've never liked that. I've always preferred the players or the managers or whoever, people in the game rather than just turning it into a popularity contest with the largest fan base. So that's always been my feeling about about the
Joe
selection.
Torre was famous for that. I remember him always choosing his jersey.
Yeah.
And trying to be in the good graces of your players. If you're the all-game manager, it kind of makes sense. If you have that opportunity that you treat your player well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's that element of it too. So what's the best solution, or what? Who knows? I don't know. I let other people worry about that. I'm not sure what the best solution is. But I liked it when the players were voting on their contemporary players. I mean, I thought that was a good system.
I think if you want the generally the most accurate, you'll probably have the players just vote on it. They can vote for anybody but themselves, because that will generally have the cream of the crop rise to the top.
Absolutely, yeah. The guys, they see who, they played against these guys, for the first half of the year. They know who's having a good year, who's not having a good year. And I think that's the most equitable. If you really want to have a game that matters, I think that's the way to do it. If you don't want to have a game that matters, then do what you want.
Yeah.
So, Gary, one thing that didn't happen to talk about a game that would have mattered, and he'll tell us about the Negro League's All-Star Games that also began in 1933, but MLB and the Negro League, of course, never did stage a game against one another as an All-Star game, to my knowledge.
That's probably true. I'm not 100% sure of that. But the Negro League All-Star Game, it was called the East-West All-Star Game. It was the highlight of the year for the Black African Americans. I was just reading a little bit over. People came from all over the country, and they poured into Chicago for that game. They would draw in the middle of the Depression. They could draw 50,000 people. When you think of all the hardships that those guys had to go through, in the middle of the Depression, they were able to put an all-star game together and draw 50,000 people. And I have some great quotes from Buck O'Neill talking about what it was like in the city of Chicago. He said the hotels were hopping, the jazz joints were hopping. The south side of Chicago was just a big party. You had black celebrities coming in. You had Cab Calloway, Louis Armstrong, Lena Horne, Bojangle, Mr. All these. It was, and then I don't know if you ever had a chance to see it. I put a video when I did that post about the 1939 Negro League All-Star Game. I put a video. Literally do get chills up and down my spine when I watch the first minute or two of that. When they're panning the stands and you see the fans, they love the game. That was the Negro Leagues. They love the Negro. Everybody's dressed. The men are in suits and hats. The women are wearing fancy hats and dresses. Everybody's happy. It's just a wonderful slice of Americana at that time. Unfortunately, with the stigma, of segregation, was certainly a blight on everything. But in the midst of all that, they were able to do this, and this was, as Buck O'Neill said, this was their game. They loved it, and in general, they loved the Negro Leagues. Again, in spite of all the hardships that the players went through, they absolutely loved the Negro Leagues. When Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier, they all knew deep down, as wonderful as that was, and they all wanted that to happen, that they knew that spelled the end of the Negro Leagues. And it was there was very mixed feelings about that. And one other point on that was that I remember reading from Larry Doby, I think it was, saying that Jackie was a great player, and nobody denied that, but the greatest was Josh Gibson, without a doubt. Everybody knew that. And it was just a tragedy that he never was able to play in the major leagues.
And it is one of the things that kind of is exciting with Major League Baseball finally kind of coming around and doing the right thing and embracing that time period. Now, with our ability to digitally restore film and photos and recreate, we're going to be able to see, hopefully, some of these games in this whole era of baseball. I think a lot of baseball fans, myself included, are woefully undereducated in.
Oh, sure. Most people are, it's, but again, I know we talked about this before. What a wonderful thing that they are including the Negro Leagues, calling them a major league. It needed to be done. As I mentioned to you the other day, the Federal League is considered a major league. It existed for 2 years with a bunch of players that they swapped over from
Renegades.
Renegades. The American, I happen to know a little bit about the American Association. It existed 10 years, 1892 to 1891. That's considered a major league. How can you deny the Negro Leagues to be a major? And I wouldn't want to be the guy who has to sort out all the records. I'm glad I don't have to do that. But someone did tell me that they're using box scores to determine, how many home, you know what I mean? And that seems like a fair way to do it.
Mhm.
If you have a box score from the game, then that'll authenticate that particular game.
Yeah, just about as well as you could. Obviously,
Yeah, just as well as you could. Yeah,
the weird stuff where like, oh, actually, this player lost a hit somewhere in his career or something. But
or the stories of Josh Gibson hit 800 home runs.
Right.
And, all right. Well, he probably did, but how many of those were in exhibition games, and stuff like that. So, and I don't deny that he was probably the greatest home run hitter of all time, but you have to have some validity or validation, and I think they're going to use existing box scores, which to me sounds like a reasonable way to do it.
It sounds like the right way, because it's like that got put. We recorded it. We know what those things are.
Yeah.
Gary, we the Negro League All-Star Game, East-West games went on beyond 1947 when Jack and Larry.
Oh,
Hill
yeah.
came in the
Yeah, I think they went on to 62. I think we decided when we were talking last time, which I know that, but it just lost its steam once it gradually.
Sure,
I mean,
sure.
not initially, but after Jackie came in and broke the color bar, gradually it just lost its steam, and they all knew that. They knew it was going to happen. And I mean, I also read quotes how much the players loved, and in spite of all the hardships they went through, and how much money were they even making? But you could talk to any of them. They all said, we loved the Negro League. We would have done it. It was our game. It was something we had. We loved the camaraderie. Can you imagine what those bus trips were like from city to city? The hardships that they had to endure, but they loved the Negro League. So it's definitely, some sadness that the Negro Leagues passed, but it certainly had to be done. There's no question about that.
There's a bittersweetness to it where you're like,
that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Where like you understand that, yes, it was inevitably, this was the path that was going to go down as soon as Jackie Robinson played in the major leagues. But
yeah,
once that happened, you had to recognize what you were losing as well as what you were gaining. And you would never be able to, like you said, kind of have that league sustain itself when you could be playing when you could be playing in Major League Baseball.
And then the other question is that you hear a lot, how many of these guys were Major League caliber? And that's, of course, hard for us to judge. But I'll go out on a limb and say a real good percentage of these guys were Major League caliber.
I would. It's the only thing that makes sense. You'd have to assume that, because how many of the guys in the major leagues weren't major league caliber?
Well, there's a lot of ways of looking at that. Again, baseball was the only professional sport. They had A ball, triple A ball, double A ball, D ball, C ball. I mean, all the way down to D. I mean, there was leagues all over the place. So to make the major leagues, you had to be a pretty darn good player, and then to stay there's always guys trying. Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of different ways of looking at that, but there's no question that, a high percentage of the Negro League players certainly could have been playing in the major leagues. That's my feeling.
I'm surprised that there's no, I don't know any television accounts, so they never televised an East-West game. Are you aware that?
No, I'm not aware of that at all. I've never heard that.
Yeah, and so they had the opportunity to do that, which just furthers the idea that, the fact that they got all these folks to show up at these games when the deck was kind of stacked against them, right? It was amazing.
Oh, yeah. And I love, like I was mentioning earlier, listening to the opening minute or two of this video that I put on that one post is highlighting the Negro League Museum in Kansas City, but it's got a lot of footage from when you listen to the introduction of the players, I do get goosebumps because the reaction of the fans, like Leon Day, and the place just goes berserk. Like Oscar Charlton, Josh Gibson. I mean, if you get a chance, play that video. Just the first couple minutes of it. It really gets to you. Just how much
we'll
they
find
love.
That and post a link about that.
Yeah. It was just such a big part of the African American culture. That's what baseball meant in the 1930s. The whites and the blacks. One other thing I was going to say real quickly. One of the highlights of being, editing or the administrator of my webpage is I get contacted by descendants of players, relatives, and I've had many of them. I think I'm up to about 50 different ones. But one of my highlights for sure is when Josh Gibson's grandson, Sean Gibson, contacted me, and I had a real nice interview with him. I wrote about it, it's on the webpage there, and I'm real proud of that one. That was probably my favorite. Although I had some other good ones too. I had Mark Dean, who is the grandson of Paul Dean. I came real close with him. I had a nice interview with Chris Baker, who is the great grandson of Home Run Baker. I got it. Yeah, that's. And if I should, I'll try to remember this. I'll put a picture of Home Run Baker and Chris Baker. They look identical. It's freaky to see.
That's great. We Home Run Baker as I believe the 1914 World Series and the Miracle Braves. No, he's just a Giant. I'm sorry, wrong. He was a Giant. Right.
He got his. In 1911 is when he got his the moniker, the homer. I think he had 2 home runs in that World Series or something. Yeah.
So
but he was a great ball player too.
And unfortunately, we didn't get to see any games between the major leagues and the start until the East-West All-Star until they came into the major leagues finally in 1947, and the game all the way up until we said until 97 they had interleague play was a game that was contested. It meant something for rights, and that 97 is about, almost 20 years after cable TV came in, when people could start seeing the players at other times. So the All-Star Game was sort of losing a little momentum even as soon as cable TV came around.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
And again, that just makes sense because of and I think this is kind of where you can start kind of getting into with the modern kind of All-Star Game, where it's just like, the idea that here's this one game at some point during the summer that you're going to see all of these players from all across the country play in this game when you normally don't get to watch 85% of them is a really cool thing. But now all I have to do is open up my phone and scroll to Twitter and like every highlight from every single guy that's playing in this game tomorrow night, every night.
Oh, sure. Yeah. While we're doing a little history of the All-Star Game, we have to mention, of course, the 1934 game. That was the second game. That's the great game when Carl Hubble struck out 5 Hall of Famers in a row. Are you guys familiar with that one?
Oh yeah.
And I did not know he struck out 5 Hall of Famers.
And it was in the grounds, and he was a giant pitcher.
Yes, that's right. And one little trivia I can give you on that one. The inning started with a single and then a walk, and then he struck out the 5 guys. I happen to know who the walk was, who he gave the walk to, only because it was Heidi Manouche. The only reason I know that is because, I don't know if you remember this, Mark, maybe 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago, I did a write-up about I was interviewed by relatives. I interviewed relatives of Heidi Manouche, and that point came up that they're very proud of that. He was the guy that walked before Carl started on the 5 strikeouts. So that's a long little bit of trivia.
I think Heidi
nobody would know that.
Was a guy who won Gordon the unofficial crown and didn't win the triple crown because they didn't award it at the time. So he had to
so it's like, you would have won it if we actually bothered keeping track of that stuff.
That's a great one. The lead off in that. So the most famous All-Star strikeout I can remember a little bit about All-Star memories in 1993, and that was John against Randy Johnson. So, Gordon, I don't know if you've ever even heard of this,
Oh, of course. How could you forget this? Because he puts his helmet on backwards and bats from the other side of the plate because he's just like, Randy Johnson.
I forgot all about that one, yeah.
So, I'm not sure it was Kruk. I think somebody else did that against Randy.
No, it was Kruk.
It was Kruk.
It was Kruk. Yeah, so it was
Kruk.
Kruk.
A left-handed hitter.
Yeah, it was Kruk.
I remember
that, yeah.
And after the first slider, he just goes to the right-handed batter's box. He's just like, I'm not going by this pitch.
I do remember that.
Yeah, and they both had mullets, and that was the only time I think I've ever seen Randy Johnson smile on the field as he walked out striking him out, because it was really funny to watch Kruk do that.
There was a sense of humility about that. There was a humility about Kruk basically giving up his at bat in the All-Star game for the joke. Not a lot of guys would have the ability to like let themselves kind of be the butt of the joke in that moment.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there's you don't have the ending because the game doesn't mean as much now, right? Pete Rose knocking over Ray Fosse in
Ray
an
Fosse, yeah, I
All-Star
remember that
game, and how hard-nosed to play. How could a guy play that hard in an All-Star?
That's right. There's a good example of how the game has the All-Star game has changed.
At the same time, I will say this for baseball's All-Star game. It is without a doubt the most enjoyable of all of like the U.S. major sports one, because the players can actually, like, they're playing it like 90 to 95% efficiency. Like if you watch the NBA All-Star game, that really doesn't resemble basketball outside of like maybe a 2-minute stretch at the end of the game.
Yeah.
Jacob deGrom, when he went out in 2015 and struck out the side on 10 pitches, that was just Jacob deGrom. He was just showing, hey, this is my stuff. Hit it if you can.
Another All-Star game I wanted to mention real quickly was the 1937 game. That's the game when Earl Averill hit a line drive off of Dizzy Dean's toe, and it started Dizzy's career going downhill because he tried to come back too soon from the injury, and it threw off his throwing mechanics, and he was never the same after that. So that's.
I gotta ask. There's never been an All-Star game brawl, right?
No.
Oh, that I
There's
don't
never
know.
been like a bench clearing incident in an All-Star game. Can you imagine if there was like a bench clearing incident in an All-Star game? That would be wild.
I think that they're, and particularly to like the players of 50 years ago would not even believe the camaraderie among Major League players in terms of how they interact with one another, both on and off the field. You just didn't do that, in 50s.
And that is something I do really enjoy about watching the Home Run Derby tonight, is when you watch that Home Run Derby, all of the players will be out on the field with like their kids and stuff, watching and cheering people on.
Yeah.
And can you imagine the crowd of players that are going to be out there tonight when Ohtani is taking his swings in the Home Run Derby? Every single person is going to be glued to that. I want to watch it. I am so curious to see what he does.
Yeah, and they, I saw some footage of, I think, Matt Olson of the A's practicing his, so these guys actually practice for the Home Run Derby. Kind of think, well, they just go out there and wing it. What the heck? It doesn't really matter. But the guys are working on their strokes, trying to hit home runs.
Which, honestly, if I'm probably an A's fan, I'm like, Matt Olson, please stop, because how many guys have we seen go to the Home Run Derby and ruin their swing for the rest of the year or their career trying to hit home runs?
I was going to make that same point. You hear that all the time. They get so involved in the Home Run Derby that the second half of the season, they're never the same again. They've injured themselves or trying to win the Home Run Derby. So
we met we'll tell you about David Wright, who won the home run derby and was bad after that for like a season or more, because he just was trying to elevate the ball, and that really wasn't his game.
Granted, now you could get away with it because nobody's going to care if you strike out if you're a true outcome player, because everybody wants you to elevate the ball and just hit tons of home runs.
And another memory that I had, the Mets were pretty bad in the late 70s and early 80s. In 1979, they had a younger named Lee Mazzilli, who was their only All-Star. And Zilli hit a game-winning home run in the All-Star game. And that, the one thing we had to cheer about as Met fans, because the team was so awful in the other way, that at least we had that.
Yeah, that's always nice when you're, even if your team is bad like the Cubs were for many years, but maybe Ernie Banks hit a home run, in the game, and that would be a big thing.
So I don't know, maybe Gary, or you can opine. Is there a way to make the game more of a contest to win the game, or is it never happen that way because the game is no longer designed in a way where those competitive juices will come out?
I would say the latter is probably true. They've just sort of done so much damage to with the interleague play and the money, the big bucks. I just don't know how you could ever go back to the way the game was played back in the 30s or the 40s or something, like where you got a guy like Ted Williams saying that was the highlight of his career.
Interestingly, though, I have seen some rumblings. I think it was Anthony DeComo, that I could be wrong on this. I did see somebody tweeting out about how changing up the major league schedule specifically in this way. So what if you went where, the vast majority of interleague games are relatively pointless outside of the couple of actually important, like regional rivalries.
Yeah.
So if we just switched over to playing within our own leagues more, that would probably actually heighten the interest in the All-Star game. Like if the Mets might play the Yankees still, What if the Mets don't play anybody from the AL Central or the AL West? It's more interesting then.
It's definitely diluted the game. There's no the interleague play.
The interleague play, the way they have it set now with the five teams in all the divisions, necessitates them having an interleague every night because they don't have teams within the state. They have to realign or add, which is more likely going to be what happens, right? You're going to add a few teams, and you'll have then 16 teams in each league, and then you'll be able to maybe unbalance schedule a little bit.
Yeah.
So I think I'd agree with both. That I like the idea that the home run contest derby has become sort of one of the highlights of it because the game itself is you be named to the team as a player because that's important contractually, reputation wise, historically, and all that. But as far as who wins the game, I would challenge a lot of people to say, well, who won the game 2 years ago? Who won the game 5 years ago? Nobody knows.
Yeah, nobody knows. The game has become pretty much meaningless.
Yeah, especially now that, contractually for a lot of these guys, like look at Jacob deGrom, who obviously probably would have been starting the All-Star game tonight. But for him, all his contract is set up to award him for making the All-Star team. They don't care. If anything, the Mets probably would prefer. They're like, yes, this is great. We don't want Jacob deGrom throwing any innings in the All-Star game and potentially getting hurt. So let's keep him out of there, but we'll give him extra money for getting named.
Yeah, and the investment is in the player, and you can't afford to have them get hurt in a game that doesn't count.
Yeah.
So same thing, and why people would bet? I won't get on a sidetrack. An All-Star game when the outcome is not uncertain, and people do. You can go get to Las Vegas.
Sure.
But people would bet, whether or not you'd be able to wake up this morning and get out of bed.
That's right.
So gamblers will bet on anything if you give them a reason to.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, Gary, thank you for joining us. I want to talk a little bit about the book that you wrote, that is the 1919 Black Sox reflections on the 1919 Black Sox. Time to take another look at a series of essays, really that bring together I saw as a 360-degree view of what went on in that season. Yeah.
Well, I read. I started out like everybody else, with 8 Men Out. I read the book, I saw the movie, and that was my understanding of it was no more than that. And then as I got involved with baseball history over the years, I read the book Burying the Black Sox by Gene Carney, and it just opened up my eyes. I came to realize that there was much more to the story than we had ever been led to believe. And what always struck me from that book was that the people who were there, who actually saw the series in person, didn't see anything amiss. And I'm not talking, a casual fan. I'm talking the official scorer, the umpires, almost all of the sports writers, the fans, the Reds, Pat Moran, the manager of the Reds. I don't think Bill Gleason saw anything. So the people who were actually there did not see anything that looked suspicious. So that sort of opened the door for me. And then I started reading a little bit more. And the next thing I did was I read the 1956 interview of Chick Gandell. It was in Sports Illustrated. And it's a fascinating interview if you ever get a chance to read it, where he basically admitted that he was the ringleader of the plot. They definitely conspired to throw the games. They took money, but when it actually came down to playing the games, he said, we played to win. By the time the games rolled around, these guys were so mentally out of whack. They had this baggage of everybody. There was rumors of a fix was in the air, and I'm convinced that that by the time they didn't know what to do, and so they had this heavy baggage, mental baggage, and they lost because they just couldn't play. Baseball is basically a mental game, and they could not play properly, with all that going on.
At a certain point, it kind of becomes like a chicken and an egg kind of thing. Did they throw the World Series or did they lose it first?
Yeah. And there's just so much to it. And the other thing that in Gene Carney's book was that one of his main points was there was different levels of guilt. Gandell was the ringleader. He's the one who was taking the money, giving it out, stuff like that. But should Buck Weaver have been thrown in there with a lifetime ban, like the ringleaders? Should Joe Jackson have been thrown in there? Buck Weaver and Joe Jackson played stellar ball. There's never been any indication that they did anything but play 100%. So I always said, I think Weaver had guilty knowledge. That's what you hear about him. That's why Landis banned him. I think looking back on it, he probably should have gotten like a 1-year suspension or something and been reinstated. So there was different levels of guilt, but they all got a one-size-fit-all punishment.
Right. Yeah.
So that was James Carney's one of his major premises. I became friends with Gene too. He came to Chicago, and on a research project, I took him out to dinner fittingly at Shoeless Joe's Sports Bar here. Not too far
of course
from
you
where I
did.
Yeah, and that was a lot. We had a really nice night there, and they have like authentic front pages from the Chicago Tribune, stuff like that in a glass cage.
Yeah.
So it was really, we had a real nice time, but he definitely was, that book is definitely the definitive book on the, and my essays are just, points that I got from that I developed.
I recommend the book to anybody who's listening and wants to learn more and more about it. I thought that you made about Joe Jackson, and we all feel he hit 357, he played well all the way around, but it took money for that, and that's your point there. Going, you get the money, you can't absolve yourself of anything because you the money. I think that's absolutely true, and that's what the point I make in there was. They really screwed themselves by taking the money. They conspired, but when money was given and accepted, I make the point. It was like they were in with the gamblers, and it's like a tower baby. Once you touch a tower, you cannot get rid of it. And their protestations of innocence just rang hollow. Once
nobody was going to listen at that point.
No, nobody. They were trying to say basically, well, we took the money, but we were going to double cross them by playing best to win. Well, nobody's going to win that one.
Right. Nobody's going to believe that.
But that's basically their argument, and it may even be true. But the fact that money was accepted just sort of makes that ring hollow. Yeah. But I guess my major point, I just think there's a lot more to the story.
And obviously you have the Time Baseball Photos Facebook page with a lot of followers there. You can check out great photos, and Gary is great at sourcing and identifying players that you look in the pictures going, I have no idea who who that, and Gary will out and find these obscure players that have been lost to their yesteryear. Well, last question, Gary. We watched the All-Star Game tonight.
Oh yeah, I'll be watching it. Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Because some people are like, it's not like it used to be. I'm glad it's still a spectacle. I know Gordon and I'll be watching too.
Yeah.
So thanks again, Gary, and hopefully have you back for another program.
I'd just like to say one thing. One of my major points I've always tried to make is how baseball is a wonderful bond between fathers and sons. And what you two guys are doing just proves that point more than anything. There's nothing like baseball to bond fathers and sons. And you guys have proved that point. I really admire you for that.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
Okay, real good. Thanks.
Thanks for listening. Subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform.
And you can follow us on Twitter at Almost Coop.